ana te kōrero he kai kei aku ringa. Engari I tōro o te ringa whakarato kai ki te maria I tēnei wiki. Ai rānei I rania te kai. Welcome to Mata with me, Mihi Ngārangi Forbes, brought to you by te Māngai Pāho and Irirangi Te Motu, New Zealand on air. Nicola Willis has called it the no BS budget. Targeted funding is largely out and an austere form of universalism is apparently in. But at whose expense? 12.8 billion gone from pay equity and millions more from programs aiming to close the gap between Māori and other New Zealanders. So what then would a Labour-led government do differently? Hei whakautu I tēnei urupaunamu, kua tatu mai nei te kaiarahi o te rōpū reipa, a Chris Hipkins. No mai, haere mai. Chris, what does this budget mean for Māori?
O tēnā koe. I don't think it's good news for Māori. I don't think it's good news for any New Zealanders. We've got a government now that's trying to turn the clock firmly backwards to some mythical past that was supposed to be perfect. Actually, the reality is it wasn't perfect. We've got to focus on moving the country forward. I think cutting the supports that some of our most vulnerable New Zealanders rely on isn't a way of creating a better future for New Zealanders.
Labour claims $750 million has been mainstreamed or removed from targeted Māori initiatives. Willie Jackson says it's $1 billion over 18 months. The government disagrees with both of those figures. Let's work with your figure, $750 million. How will it impact kaupapa Māori, and which areas will be impacted the most in your view?
Well, I think it's going to affect Māori across the board because even some of the mainstream cuts that they've made are going to disproportionately affect Māori. So if you take 18, 19-year-old unemployed Māori, for example, and the government's decision effectively to cut unemployment support for 18 and 19-year-olds, we know that there'll be a number of Māori that are supported, that are currently supported through that system, that will lose that support. We know that changes they're making in the health system, for example, are going to affect Māori twice because they're cutting programs that are specifically designed to deal with the fact that Māori have poorer health outcomes than non-Māori, have lower life expectancy than non-Māori. They're cutting those specific programs, but then overall spending less money on health than is required to keep the system running is also going to disproportionately affect Māori. So I think you can look at it both ways. They're cutting dedicated support for Māori, but then actually the cuts that they're making to supports that all New Zealanders rely on will disproportionately affect Māori as well.
Minister for Māori Development, Tama Pōtaka, would argue that actually there's going to be more money in, say, housing for Māori to that is going to benefit Māori. As a leader, what's your strategy to raise Māori outcomes? Do you support targeted Māori funding, or are you an advocate for mainstreaming?
Well, I think there's a conversation for us to have about where targeting is appropriate and where universalism is appropriate. So let's take something like vaccination, for example. We previously had a system around vaccination where vaccination was available 50 plus if you're Māori and 60 plus if you are non-Māori. I actually think there's a case for saying it should be 50 plus for everybody. So basically we should take the group most in need and use that as the baseline and make sure that everybody gets access to that. On the other hand, there are going to be some areas in health where a targeted approach is appropriate for Māori.
Like bowel screening?
Well, bowel screening, I actually think that's probably one where you could also, basically just lower the age for everyone. So I think the government took the wrong approach. Māori were getting bowel screening from 50 and other New Zealanders from 60, and they basically took bowel screening off Māori in order to give it to another 2 years of everybody having access to it, when actually we should have just gone the other way. We should have just said, look, everybody should have access to it from 50. But I think if you look at some of the outreach programs, it might not so much be about eligibility for universal entitlements like vaccination, bowel screening. It might be about the effort we put into reaching some of those hard-to-reach communities. So those by Māori, for Māori approaches do deserve dedicated funding because they're going to deliver healthcare to Māori in a way that's actually going to reach them.
If you are to return to power, would you commit to reversing that $750 million of targeted funding?
We've said that we'll set out our alternative budget and our policy priorities before the election. One of the reasons it's hard to do that right now is the government's still got a whole nother budget to go. So we haven't yet got to the bottom of what they've cut in this year's budget, and they've still got another one to go. And so we've got to make sure that what we promise next time around, we've worked through the detail of it. We know that we can afford to do it. We know how much it will cost and so on. And costs can change between now and the next election as well. Some things will get cheaper. Some things will get more expensive.
But because you've said 750 million and because Willie Jackson's saying 1 billion, Māori would be expecting something of that kind.
I think Māori can certainly expect to see that, making sure that we're dealing with those issues that have concerned Māori, like, poorer health outcomes, poorer educational outcomes, poorer housing outcomes. Will we be targeting those at the next election? Absolutely.
Māori Development Minister Tama Potaka has announced 14 million for Māori and Pacific Wardens and Māori Women's Welfare League and 4 million over 4 years for Kohanga Reo for the ICT support. David Seymour, who is about to become the next Deputy Prime Minister, has said, quote, "There is no such thing as Māori funding. There's funding for New Zealanders." What do you make of that statement?
I think David Seymour and Tama Potaka clearly at loggerheads here. For once, I actually agree with Tama Potaka. I think there is a case for dedicated funding for exactly the sorts of things that you've just mentioned. Having said that, other New Zealanders benefit from that too. So the Māori Wardens, for example, the work they do around community safety benefits all of us, not just Māori. The work we did around vaccination, for example, there's a lot of New Zealanders who never visited a marae until they went to get their COVID-19 vaccinations at a marae. So I think it shows that some of the targeted approaches can benefit everybody as well.
In 1999, the fifth Labour government introduced Closing the Gaps. It was a program. It came in response to inequities exacerbated by more than a decade of neoliberal policies designed to counteract systemic racism. It was praised by many as a brave move. The opposition attacked it, Winston Peters at the time calling it social apartheid, and it was later quietly shelved. What will your Closing the Gaps approach be?
Well, it was sort of shelved but I think we backed away from the fight, for the argument a bit too quickly because it was sort of reborn with a different name. I think it was reducing disparities or reducing inequities. Yes. It was just relabeled something else and a lot of that work continued on. I don't think we should have shied away from the argument quite as quickly as we did because I think there was real justification for a lot of that Closing the Gaps work. Frankly, when all New Zealanders are thriving, we're all going to be better off. And that means that we can't afford to simply say we're willing to settle for Māori having lower life expectancy, poorer health outcomes, poorer educational outcomes. We should be aiming to do something about that. But the one thing I'd say about Closing the Gaps, which I didn't necessarily like, is that it immediately kind of puts a deficit lens over the top of it rather than an opportunity lens.
So what is the opportunity? Because Willie Jackson is calling this budget the mother of all anti-Māori budgets. You are going to have a strategy if you want to pull out of it. What is yours?
I haven't kind of got the marketing slogans right yet, but I think our focus will be in New Zealand, an Aotearoa New Zealand, where everyone's thriving. And that includes Māori, Pacifica, non-Māori alike. And it does mean addressing a lot of the disparities that continue, in some cases, to, if not get worse, at least they're not getting better.
And can you guarantee that whatever the kaupapa that's targeting Māori inequities within your new strategy won't disappear when things get tough?
Well, I've already made it clear. I haven't backed away from a lot of the arguments before the last election that we know were unpopular with New Zealanders. So I think some of the debate around co-governance, for example, and things like that became so polarising. But rather than back away from them, I've actually taken the time to explain what we were doing and why we were doing it. Because I think, and actually it's not just a Labour thing. There are responsible leaders on the other side of the political aisle who are doing the same. I look at some of the public comments Jenny Shipley has made in the last year or so, and I fully endorse them because she's not willing to shy away from what is a tough debate for New Zealanders. She's showing leadership. I wish the National Party in Parliament today would show the sort of leadership on these issues that Jenny Shipley is showing from outside of Parliament.
You talked about Three Waters. It's a good segue. Not long after it was launched, the narrative around it appeared to be hijacked. Critics claimed it was co-governance, that Māori would own all the water and they'd have equal governance power over it. Do you take responsibility for losing control of your story here?
Absolutely. As a government, yes, we do. I think we have to recognise we lost the narrative on water reform. Ultimately, it was actually about affordable water reform. It was about making sure that this massive infrastructure deficit that we've got around water was dealt with in the most cost-effective way. But it also recognised that Māori have fought for a long time to have their rights recognised. And I think the compromise that we tried to reach with water reform, with the Three Waters as it was then known, was actually trying to recognise something that Māori have fought a long time for.
When things go wrong, we usually reflect on them. So Why did you lose the narrative?
I don't think we talked about it enough. I don't think we explained what we were doing and why we were doing it. It wasn't radical. It wasn't handing over ownership of water to Māori or any such radical notion. It was saying, actually, Māori have fought for a long time to have their rights in water recognised under the treaty, and they've won that fight. There is legal recognition through the Waitangi Tribunal of that. Let's make sure that's reflected in the way we set up those water entities. It wasn't that radical either. And frankly, I think the fact that Māori were willing to compromise, and support what was effectively a fairly light touch model around the governance of the water entities, I thought was quite remarkable.
Well, I mean, when I look back at that period of time, there were people talking about it. It wasn't Anaya Mahuta. She seemed to be out on her own. What happened to the rest of the Labour leadership? Did you just simply not know how to explain it?
Yeah, I sort of inserted myself much more into that debate when I became the Prime Minister, and I don't think that we backed Nanaia up enough. I think leaving a strong Māori woman out there defending that by herself wasn't okay. I think we dropped the ball there and we left her isolated, and I don't think that was right.
Going forward, how are you going to protect, how are you going to lead those kōrero around the treaty and the policies that you're going to be rolling out?
I think we've got to focus the country on the things that unite us. Moving forward together means finding common ground. It doesn't mean agreeing, and it doesn't mean being the same. We can respect each other's differences. So when you're dealing with Māori and non-Māori, there are some non-Māori who are going to feel very comfortable in the Māori world, and there are others for whom it will be very new. That's okay. We can create space for all of that when we look to find common ground. We look to find the things that bring us together. People like Winston Peters, David Seymour, even Christopher Luxon, they're looking for wedges. They're looking for the things that separate us. We've got to look for the things that bring us together. Because when we do that...
They also command a platform and they get the airtime. So what is your government going to do if you were to return to power to make sure that you keep on top of the narrative?
Not stoop to that level. I think that's one of the.
Would that work?
I think that's one of the key lessons for all of us is not to stoop to that level. I think and here's a good example. I was speaking to someone the other day who had been in the United States during the last presidential election campaign, speaking to someone who was about to vote for Donald Trump, and they basically said that they didn't really agree with Donald Trump, but they were voting for him all the same. And they said, and so they were questioned on why. And they said, well, how can I vote for the Democrats when they call me a racist, they call me a redneck, they call me all of these names? How could I vote for people who are calling me those things? And I think that's a pitfall, that's a trap we've got to avoid here. I think throwing labels around and getting people's backs up is not the way that you have constructive conversations. Actually, there are New Zealanders who are open to changing their mind on things if we can find a space for civilised conversation.
In the war on the woke, whose side are you on?
Oh, look, I'm for an inclusive New Zealand.
Are you woke?
You can call me whatever you like. It's a label that I just don't think has value.
But it's an argument that's been imported into Aotearoa.
That's right.
And we're living it. So how do you beat it?
I don't think you beat imported culture wars by fighting a culture war of your own. I think you beat it by focusing on the things that bring us together. I want New Zealand to be a place where people can be who they are. And, I just think what's so threatening about that? Why do we need to sit in judgment on our fellow New Zealanders all of the time? People can live the lives that they choose to live. Back
to the budget for a second.
Yeah.
The opposition leader traditionally opposes the budget, but did the budget get anything right?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the investment boost, fine, open to the idea that, yes, we should do things that encourage investment in New Zealand, particularly investment by New Zealand businesses in growing New Zealand business. I don't know whether they've got the settings for that right yet. So there's some speculation from economists that it might end up costing way more because they might have, the lack of any controls over it might cause a problem. But the concept, totally open to. But beyond that, it's difficult to see much that I'd agree with.
On Q&A, Finance Minister Nicola Willis was asked about the poverty targets, which they aren't forecast to meet. Will you commit to improving the 3 child poverty targets?
Well, yes, absolutely. But I think in terms of the cost of different initiatives in the budget, one of the things that we're often focused on is just the upfront cost, not the long-term benefits. So some of the budget investments that we can make now produce a longer-term benefit. So you're spending money now, but you're saving money in the longer term. Money spent now on keeping kids out of prison in the long term, for example, saves the country money. So, investing in those early intervention programs that make sure kids actually have a better future, that's going to save the country money in the longer term. So I think we do have to look. So, the current government talk about social investment, spend $1 now, save $7 further into the future. But the reverse also applies. Cut $1 of spending now, you can incur $7 of cost further into the future. Unfortunately, this year's budget does a lot of that. It basically cuts money now, which is going to mean things get more expensive for us because we'll be mopping up the consequences of those cuts longer term.
Faced with the same set of circumstances as Nicola Willis, what would a Labour-led government have done?
Well, we would have made different choices. I wouldn't have funded big tax cuts for landlords, for tobacco companies, for multinational companies like Google and Facebook, who are going to get, $500 million of this year's budget. So will those go? Well, we'll set that out before the next election. But you're asking me about what choices we would have made if we were writing the budget this year, and those would have been different choices. But there's still 18 months to go. Government's still got another budget to go. But we'll be clear before the election exactly what we're promising. But we would have made different choices to this government.
And if you are to return $1 billion back to targeted Māori and other kaupapa like that, how would you pay for that? I mean, even Treasury believes that we should be borrowing more to spend on infrastructure in particular. Are you open to that idea? Again,
we'll set all that out before the election, but what are the broad kind of economic goals we'll be aiming for? We do need to aim to get the books back into balance so that we're not continuing to spend more than we're earning as a government, but there is a case for borrowing in areas like infrastructure because you're borrowing for things that over the time add value to the country. And I think the problem is Nicola Willis at the moment is borrowing record amounts to basically because she can't make the budget balance. That's not sustainable. But borrowing to invest in roads, schools, hospitals, the infrastructure, the sorts of investments that we're going to rely on in the future, that is justified.
If you're not an economist and listening to you and then listening to Nicola Willis, who says that they inherited an awful economic mess, it's quite difficult to understand, like everyone's throwing the blame at each other. Where do you find the middle ground?
Well,
how do you explain that to voters?
Well, first of all, the economy, the government finances, they're not like a household budget, despite Nicola Willis trying to tell you that they are. Actually, everything's gotten worse under this government. So,
well, let's put it this way. Did you leave a mess?
No, absolutely not. So, yes, we were going through a difficult period with a spike in inflation internationally and the shock that was causing around the world. But New Zealand was not alone in that. And we were very well positioned to bounce back. So we would have been back in surplus by 2027. Nicola Willis has now pushed that out to 2029 at the earliest. We were going to get borrowing under control earlier than she has. That's all been pushed out. So ultimately, the choices this government's made has made the situation worse. We were poised for recovery at the election. It was a tough time, though. Let's be clear about that. It was a very tough time. But unfortunately, this government have delayed any signs of economic recovery.
I have to jump into this issue. Women are wild across the country at the 12.8 billion saved in the budget from equity claims. You have not committed to reversing the 33 claims. Why not?
No, I have. I've absolutely said that we will reverse the law changes that the government have made. What I can't do at this point is say exactly how much that's going to cost because we've got to get into where that $12 billion figure came from and what that's made up of. And of course, it will change between now and the next election as well. So we will set that out in our fiscal plan, how much it will cost to reverse the changes. But we will reverse the changes.
If it is $12.8 billion, as Nicola Willis says, is she right then? Did it blow out? Has it got out of control?
Well, we don't know because the government haven't released a breakdown of that $12 billion. And I think it's time that they did so that people can see exactly what that's based on. It is a big number, but we need to understand exactly what's driven that number. My view is that women in New Zealand shouldn't be told you have to accept being paid less than men simply because it's too expensive to fix the problem.
You have never led a coalition negotiations. You've led a government, but you may need to get into negotiations. Where do you see your synergies with the Greens and Te Pāti Māori?
We have a lot of values in common. I think, we also believe, all three of those parties, I think, believe in a more inclusive New Zealand, a more community-focused New Zealand, one where we recognise that our collective interests are as strong as our individual interests. So I think we have a common set of values in that regard. We do have some pretty pronounced differences, though. Some of the Māori Party's policies just recently, for example, I think will be far too much for most New Zealanders, and we'll be clear about which ones we simply won't entertain, and we will be clear about that. But I think probably the big difference is we have to recognise under MMP we need to work together. But unlike Christopher Luxon, I don't think that means that you need to let Winston Peters, David Seymour, the smaller parties get a smaller share of the vote, call all of the shots. I think they've been allowed to get away with far too much under this government.
So the Greens and Te Pāti Māori, if you were to go into a coalition, would you would have a lot more power?
I think the Greens and Te Pāti Māori, if we were working with them, would have a share of influence that was proportionate to how much vote and how much a share of the vote they get from the New Zealand public. I think that's what people expect under MMP.
The reason I'm only talking about the Greens and Te Pāti Māori is because Winston Peters has ruled out ever being in a coalition with Labour if you're the leader. What do you make of that? Does that narrow your options?
I think the country's sick of being held to ransom by Winston Peters and David Seymour, quite frankly. But what it does make it very clear is if you're voting for Winston Peters and for New Zealand First, you're voting for Christopher Luxon and David Seymour and that coalition of chaos to continue. And that means you're voting for things like more asset sales, cuts to New Zealand superannuation, all of the things that National have been very clear that they're campaigning on at the next election. If you vote for Winston Peters and New Zealand First, that's what you're voting for.
You mentioned Te Pāti Māori and some of their policies earlier. You've spoken out about their punishment dished out to them over the haka in Parliament. They chose not to appear before the Privileges Committee, and the two co-leaders didn't turn up for the budget debate. What do you make of that?
I think both instances were an opportunity for them to show up and show leadership. So I defended, or I said that I thought the sanction that was being proposed was totally disproportionate. Suspending them for 24 hours, in line with what other people have been sanctioned for similar kind of breaches of the rules of Parliament, would have been perfectly justifiable. But 21 days, never been done before in New Zealand's history, I think was wrong. But I also think the Māori Party didn't have to go to the Privileges Committee, but I think they should have. They started a debate around tikanga in the House and then walked away from it. They should have showed up and said, actually, we stand by having more tikanga in the House, and this is what it looks like, and this is what Parliament should do to accommodate that.
Should we have more tikanga in the House?
Absolutely. But as a non-Māori New Zealander, I'm not going to tell Parliament what that should look like. I think our Māori members should actually be articulating that. They missed an opportunity to do that. So I think they're more interested in protesting outside than showing up and, constructively engaging in a debate around how the tikanga of the House can be improved.
What's your electoral strategy for the Māori seats?
We'll go out to win them all, as we have in every election. So we'll be competing vigorously there.
Is it possible we could see Nanaia Mahuta stand again for Labour?
I haven't spoken to Nanaia about that. I think last time I spoke to her, I think that was, I don't think she had that front of mind for her. But I haven't spoken to her in the last little while. I'm catching up with her in a couple of weeks, actually, but I haven't spoken to her for a wee while. As it stands with your Māori caucus,
are you confident that those members will be able to really have a go in those seats?
Of course, we've got some great Māori MPs now, but the opportunity we've got in 2026 is to get more. So there'll be some new candidates. So not all of those seats will be contested by people who are familiar faces. Some of them will be new, and that'll be really positive, and that'll be really healthy.
Why should people vote for you?
Because we're going to bring the country back together. We're going to focus on the things that unite us. So I've said that the next Labour government will be focused on things like jobs, health and homes. So, we all have an interest in making sure that we're doing a better job in all of those areas. I want to bring the country together. I want to make sure we're working constructively, that we're focused on the future, not on the past, that we're not just constantly, engaging in this back and forth, cut this, cut that we're actually moving the country forward.
Chris, thank you for your time.
Tēnā koe.
I te whakarongo koutou kia Chris Hipkins, kai arahi o te rōpū reipa. Ko te pūnaha ohanga te take, ko te oranga tangata, te wawata, tēnā rā koutou I aro mai ki tēnei patapātai. Tēnei te mihi ki te Māngai Pāho me irirangi te motu, nā rāua tēnei hōtaka I tautoko. We'll be back with more mata in a fortnight. Nohoro mai.